a second. I hate to do this, but a little more education on the size of these things. The one dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What was it, little man, big boy?
Let's see. It was Fat Man was Nagasaki, and
right.
Little Boy was Hiroshima.
There you go.
And the Hiroshima bomb is estimated. There's different estimates, but let's just say 15,000 tons of TNT explosive equivalent. They have to compare it to something, so they compare it to TNT. But a nuclear detonation is really different, fundamentally different than a high explosive chemical detonation for a couple of reasons. The stellar temperatures it produces, literally a couple 100 million degrees centigrade at the instant of detonation at the center of the fireball.
So in other words, that's actually not then a completely accurate description of the power of the weapon at all.
Right. There's an article on my website by Professor Lynn Eden called City on Fire. She points out that the U.S. military has significantly underestimated the destructive capabilities of their own nuclear weapons because they don't really consider thermal effects or the effects of fire, which I was describing earlier.
Yes.
But you asked about the explosive power. So it's 15,000 tons of TNT, and when that's detonated, it will ignite fires simultaneously over an area of about 3 to 5 square miles. And that's opposed to the modern, they call them strategic nuclear weapons. These are the weapons that are possessed by the 5 recognized nuclear weapon states. But the smallest, I hate to use the word small, but the smallest yield of or explosive power of a strategic weapon is 100,000 tons of TNT. And the U.S. ICBMs usually have somewhere between 300,000 tons of TNT to 475,000 tons of TNT. The Russian ones are generally a little bit bigger. They're about 800,000 tons of TNT. Our bombers, our nuclear bombers can carry a nuclear gravity bomb, the B-83, that has 1.3 million tons of TNT explosive power.
Excuse me?
Yeah. Well, they call those megatons. The kilotons means 1,000 tons, so 15 kilotons, Hiroshima. After hydrogen bombs were invented in the early 1950s, it wasn't all that long before American bombers were carrying multi-megaton weapons around. That was, you probably remember, in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the average warhead size, is usually 2 or 3 million tons of TNT. And China still has, I think their warheads are believed to be about 3 million tons of TNT explosive power. They don't have a lot of missiles that can hit the U.S., but they have some. And they're just like every other nuclear weapon state, they're modernizing their arsenals. So,
just a little bit of trivia, if there is such thing in the subject. I believe that we accidentally dropped 2 nuclear weapons on North Carolina.
Mm-hmm. And there was an accident, a B-52.
Yes.
What the end result was they back then they carried these multi-megaton gravity bombs, and a couple of them got loose and went down. They have what they call permissive action links. They're basically a safety device that are built into each weapon, at least the United States has, and they have to be triggered sequentially in order for the bomb to go off. There's usually like a series of, say, 6 or 7, and on one of the bombs, there was only one left. All the others had been triggered, so we would have had probably... we would have had millions of tons of explosive power going off there. The fallout would have gone all the way to New York City. It probably would have killed most of the people in North Carolina, I would guess.
One more 5-volt little signal, and it would have been as you described.
Right. And, there's other accidents that we don't know about.
Well, before we leave that one, what I heard was that they retrieved one of those weapons, and one of them... they didn't.
There actually is one that is in the ocean off the coast, and I don't really find that very reassuring.
No.
If you know about World War I, they're still digging up artillery shells that they're corroded on the outside, but they're fine on the inside.
Right.
So I don't know, but I mean, there are nuclear bombs scattered around the bottom of the ocean. There have been some that have fallen off aircraft carriers off the coast of Japan that rolled off the deck. It's a hell of a mess, really.
Yes. All right. So we have hydrogen bombs now, and these are the ones, for example, like the B-83, right? That would be a hydrogen bomb with yields up to, 1.3 million tons?
Yes. The design of nuclear weapons, so the difference between the atomic bomb, then they came up with a hydrogen bomb, and the first hydrogen bombs were enormous, and they stayed that way for a long time. In the 1980s and 90s, they actually started making them smaller in explosive power, but this was primarily because they were able to put them on the top of ballistic missiles, and they came up with multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles, so you can put, say, 10 warheads on one missile.
Right.
They're generally, the strategic weapons now range in the hundreds of thousands of tons of TNT explosive power, but some are over 1 million. And I really have no doubt that both the United States and Russia still have some multi-megaton weapons that they keep somewhere in case they need them. We still have 4,000 or 5,000 weapons that they call them scheduled for dismantlement. So they actually don't go into the totals that the United States puts out as far as how many weapons we have. They'll announce that we have 4,000 weapons, but then they don't mention that there's 4,000 that are still basically in the same condition they were a few years ago and maybe in the same place. So they schedule them for dismantlement. So I call that disarmament by semantics.
Mm-hmm. So in a way, multiple warheads are just a way of doing more with less, sort of.
If you want to get into the calculations, if you set off a number of smaller warheads over an area, you actually create more blast damage and just as big a thermal effects as one big warhead. Military planners tend to focus on blast, which is because they want to, and so that's why a city like New York or, Washington, D.C. would be a good example. They might target it with, say, 40 warheads, where actually one of these 800 kiloton warheads would be more than enough to set the whole city and way beyond into the suburbs on fire.
100 and some odd miles, right?
They calculate these firestorms based on average weather conditions, but even under the very worst weather conditions, for an 800 kiloton warhead, you're going to have about 90 square miles where you're going to have a certain fire zone. Mm-hmm. But on average weather conditions, it's more like about 150 square miles, and it can be more than that on an exceptionally clear day. So on my website, I focus on fire because, as we mentioned earlier, the fire is what creates the smoke. And the smoke gets up into the stratosphere and can block the sunlight and create these ice age weather conditions on Earth that eliminate the ability to grow food crops for years.
Assuming a full exchange, how long would a nuclear winter?
Well, there's actually new studies that are being done. I keep in touch with my friends, the scientists, and it looks like it could be 20 years even, but I mean, the global grain reserves right now are maybe enough for a couple of months. But you mentioned, I think at some point, India and Pakistan. Well, they have a big nuclear arms race going on there now. But what they produce initially, at least, are atomic bomb-sized weapons. They have about 200 operational atomic bombs, the 15 kiloton or 15,000 ton size. So the scientists did a study on a war with 100 of those being detonated in their cities.
Right.
And they found, they predicted about 5 million tons of smoke would get into the stratosphere. That would be enough to block about 10% of the sunlight from reaching the surface of the Earth for at least 3 or 4 years, maybe 7. And the smoke would stay up there for longer than 10. This would cause enough of a decrease in crop production that it would it's predicted that up to 2 billion people would starve to death just from India-Pakistan.
Actually, India and Pakistan have been right up to the brink any number of times, right?
That's right, yes, that's true. And they're not getting along all that well right now, from what I read.
Well, it seems, Professor, we once lived in a world where MAD was, sort of the operational mutual assured destruction stopped everything from happening. Now, I wonder if if nuclear war might be possible on a smaller scale. I know
Yes.
this is what they toy with, these ideas they toy with, these games, as it were, war games. Is it possible? Is a smaller nuclear exchange survivable?
Well, it's not survivable if you happen to be in the target area.
No, of course not. Of course not.
But I would say that any war is possible. The fact that we have launch-ready nuclear weapons that can be launched even in the course of this conversation, it's been like that for years, so there's sort of a false sense of security. What worries me these days, a couple things. Here in the United States, I'm worried because there seems to be a general lack of knowledge and understanding about the consequences of nuclear war. And there's also appears to me to be an idea that we can just threaten the Russians and they'll back down. So what happens if they don't, or militaries come into direct contact? As far as India and Pakistan, they're right on each other's border. If they launch a nuclear weapon, a ballistic missile, it'll detonate in a matter of a minute or two or less, So they don't even have really early warning systems like we've constructed these early warning systems because since we're on the opposite sides of the planet, it gives us enough time to detect the launch and then pass the warning up to the president. And then he can decide whether he wants to launch a retaliatory strike based just on early warning system data. And if that's wrong, then he's actually launching a preemptive nuclear strike. But all of these things, and I've written about this. I just did an article in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists today about launching before or after the detonation of a nuclear weapon, based on early warning systems. But the problem is that we're talking, when we get into those sorts of discussions, we're avoiding the real issue that's never discussed, and that's the environmental consequences of nuclear war. That has never been discussed by any of the nuclear weapon states in a public way, and it's avoided.
Well, I want to give the preppers a small reason to continue to prep. It is a small reason.
Sure.
Relatively. Now, if there was an exchange between India and Pakistan, things would be bad. But if you're prepared, survivable, I take it, in North America.
Well, if you want to look at a scenario like that, and historically famine has been caused not just by lack of food, but also by scarce, rising prices and the inability to purchase, and then the restriction of exports. Mm-hmm. I think that if there was a war in India and Pakistan where nuclear weapons were detonated and this global stratospheric smoke layer was produced, and it was quite clear that like for example, you wouldn't be able to grow wheat in Canada for a few years, then the exporting countries that grow grain would probably say, okay, that's it. We're not sending anything overseas. We got to keep this for ourselves. So all the populations that are dependent on imported foods, especially grains, are going to just be SOL. So that's first of all, there's about 1 billion people right now that live on the edge of starvation. And Dr. Ira Helpin from Physicians for Social Responsibility, I'm actually a senior scientist with them too. He wrote a couple of papers that shows that if you reduce a caloric intake of somebody who's already starving by just even 10 or 15% over the course of a year, they're going to starve to death.
Right.
And we're looking at 10 to 20% reductions for sure in the rice and the corn crops in China and the United States, and even worse further north. So, I think, if you're a prepper, it kind of depends what you're preparing for.
Well,
I don't think there's anything wrong. I'm into self-sufficiency myself. I live out on a small farm. I have apple trees. I have a photovoltaic electric system.
Right.
But I like that, and I think it makes sense if people need to do that in general these days.
I'm with you all the way. I've got solar panels. I've got generators, on and on and on. Anyway, again, I want to come back to this scenario, and I know you don't like any scenario that involves nuclear weapons. Nobody would, but
sure.
This particular one, India and Pakistan, let's say they really let it loose. Somebody in North America, let's say in Ohio, I don't know, what effects would that person in Ohio have to live with over any number of months or years?
Well, I can give you some pretty good answers to that. The scientists that did these studies, they compared it to, there was a volcanic eruption, the largest one in the last 500 years, called Mount Tambora.
Oh, Tambora.
Yeah, and the summer that followed that eruption was called, it was called the Year Without Summer.
Mm-hmm.
That was actually when they wrote the novel Frankenstein, But there was, they were killing, in North America, they were killing frosts every month of the year in June, July, and August in New England. And there was famine in England, in Europe. There wasn't much of a density of population in the United States, and there was enough wildlife and everything. I don't think there was famine here, but what we would, so they predict that the cold that would follow the sort of war that you're describing between India and Pakistan would actually be twice as cold. It would be colder than it's been in the last 1,000 years, would be the average surface temperatures. And that's quite cold.
So, wait a minute. I'm in Ohio. How am I doing?
Well, you're gonna have a really severe winter. As far as food, well, who knows? The United States, a lot of things have changed here in the last 10 or 20 or 30 years, and we're really dependent on, so many different types of imports that would have been sort of a joke if we thought about it, in the 1970s and 60s.
Right.
I don't know. Our whole infrastructure is very fragile in terms of there's a couple days worth of food, maybe a week's worth at the most in our grocery stores.
That's true.
If something breaks down under those circumstances, then we're going to be in trouble. I don't know. I don't think it's going to be below freezing every day here. It's not going to be that cold. It's not going to be literally like colder than Ice Age weather, but it's going to be damn cold, and I suspect food's going to be scarce. And, but when you get into a situation with nuclear war and global famine, I think that just totally destabilizes the international relations, and, who knows what that would lead to. So when you try to make predictions on that, it's kind of...
That's another